Hey, y'all. Welcome to Business Makers Podcast. We're back. It's good to be with you. I have an interesting show coming up. Greg Treat from the Avalon Circle Consulting will be coming on the show, and hopefully some kind of interesting ways of thinking about your family and covenant household, and maybe actually how to structure legally your household for all sorts of benefits. So don't forget that our Fight Laugh Feast conference is going to be October 31st through November 2nd in Fort Worth, Texas. We actually have all sorts of great speakers. You might already know some of them. Pastor Doug Wilson, Pastor Toby, of course, Dr. George Grant. We've also added Dusty Devers to the list. Excited to have him join the speaker list. And then, of course, Steve Dace and others coming to Fort Worth, Texas, just days before the election there. And the best way to kind of consume our content and be in touch with everything that we got going on is download our app, Fight Laugh Feast app. Go download it in kind of your whatever app store, Google Play, Apple Store. Download our app, Fight Laugh Feast or Cross Politic. You can type in there and download our app, and it's a great way to connect with us. Lastly, we really function and run by club memberships and corporate partners. So if you have a corporation, a business that is interested in supporting our efforts and what we do, or you're thinking about joining our club membership, that's a great way to support our efforts and what we're doing. And we really are grateful for the support and everything that's going on. All right. So as you guys know, Business Makers is about equipping entrepreneurs, business leaders, and investors to build, grow, and establish businesses for the glory of God. And a bunch of us, we're just ordinary Christians striving for extraordinary results. We believe that God, that Jesus is King over Lord over heaven and earth. And that includes our finances. That includes our businesses. And we want to not just bury our talents in the backyard, but we want to see God's blessing in our lives, at 5, 10, 50, 30, 30, 60, 100-fold. And so we really want to use our businesses for the glory of God. And so I have with me today Gregory Treat. Gregory Treat is a strategic business consultant with a focus on covenantal business structures and generational succession. Greg serves leaders who are convinced that the covenantal household is God's chosen vehicle for raising up physical and spiritual lineages that grow in kingdom influence, father to son, mother to daughter, teacher to student, generation to generation. Greg, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So I actually want to start with where were you raised? I want to kind of go back. I want to know Greg from the beginning and how he got to where he's at now. Where you grew up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little dairy ranch in the Contra Costa Bay Area in Northern California in the early 90s. Yeah. We were a fourth generation small family ag operation. And those of you who are familiar with the history of California over the past 30 years might think, oh, that doesn't sound like a very good strategic position. And indeed, it wasn't. So my childhood kind of consisted of the family business being, slowly sliced to death by various regulations and bureaucrats and inspections. I mean, they just didn't want us there anymore. And so probably from the time until I was 6, until we actually finally sold the land at 17, that was our life. We were trying to preserve some kind of household. I mean, I grew up we had a family library, thousands of books lining the walls. I got to read the people talk about the Western canon, the greats, Aristotle, Plato. It was all on there, and I was privileged to grow up in an environment where especially my great grandmother had laid that in store for me. Really gave me an incredible education. So that's how I was raised.
Yeah, have you followed like the Netherlands farmer protests and that kind of thing? I have a buddy who's also his family owns thousands of acres in California.
Mm-hmm.
He said that California farmers should have been thrown down like that 25 years ago.
They absolutely should have been.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Where'd you end up going to college?
So I went to college at the Master's College, as it was then, now the Master's University, which is John MacArthur School in Southern California. And then I went to law school at McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, which is I call it the least liberal law school in Northern California. It's not a high bar, but it was a good school and gave me a good foundation in business education and tax and those kinds of things. So
okay. And so now you're with Avalon Circle. Make sure I got it right. Avalon Circle Consulting. And is it a law firm? What exactly is Avalon Circle Consulting?
So Avalon Circle is my consulting group. So when I worked after law school, I graduated from law school in 2016. Went
Mm.
and took the bar in Texas because we wanted to live in Texas. That's where we wanted to raise our family, me and my wife. We have 6 kids now. Just had our sixth very recently.
Nice.
So we wanted to be in a less constraining environment than California. So I took the Texas bar and eventually wound up working for a boutique estate planning law firm doing high level estate planning, trusts, some tax work, all the things that go along with that. And I really experienced. There's kind of two ways to think about estate planning. Just like with a business, if you go to a business attorney, you get an LLC, you go to a bank, get a bank account, and you have a contract, right? Do you have a business? Well, you
Mhm.
have the legal forms of a business, but in order to actually have a business, you have to have, a model. You have to know where I'm going to go buy this to bring it over to this place, to have these people do something to it, and then I can sell it over here, right? You need that process, inputs, outputs, processes, and incentives, right?
Mhm.
And what I experienced was a lot of great, excellent legal work, but not a lot of work on, okay, what is the family going to put into these legal structures? It's very well to have a family trust, a family limited partnership, very complex LLC structures. But if you don't know, hey, what is our goal for our children? How are we going to raise them to achieve those goals? How are we going to equip them so that when monies and responsibility, and money always creates responsibility,
Mhm.
come to them, that they're ready for it, that they know what their parents, what their ancestors, and really what God would have them do with that money.
Mhm. And so, I remember when we talked on the phone before, you particularly have, uh, uh, um, you're advocating for putting your family into a business structure like an LLC or a family LLC or something like that.
Absolutely.
Um, and I've never thought about that before. I mean, I have an LLC for cross politic. I have an LLC for other things I'm doing.
Hmm.
But I mean, can you? I didn't even think you could do it. Why? How's it even possible you can put your family in an LLC?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. I think the first question we have to ask is what is a family and who's defining it, right? Kind of in the
Mhm.
modern cultural context, the family is defined as this unprofitable parasite, right? So we have our businesses that they make money and they generate value, and the family, which does all of this, child rearing and lots of dishonorable things like that we don't understand why anyone would do,
Yeah,
that's not profitable or valuable.
right.
Okay. Now,
Why?
of
Why?
course, if you're an honest capitalist, you're going to say, hey, things only happen because they're incentivized to happen.
Yeah,
And for the past maybe 80, maybe 100 years, the market has just assumed someone somewhere uncompensated is just going to raise really highly qualified, really high quality people that are loyal, honest,
yeah.
hardworking. And we don't have to pay any money. We can just find those people. They will magically appear out of nowhere, and we
Mm,
don't have to compensate or give any honor or respect to the people doing that very difficult work. And of course, that's what gets you in and your culture into the situation we now have. White
yeah,
collar crime is just skyrocketing, right? I mean, business entities have to basically reparent someone almost from the ground up when they get them, especially if they're not from a very Christian culture. And I mean, I know you guys out there in Moscow are deeply familiar with all your educational endeavors, and there's a stark difference between someone who is homeschooled or classically trained, went to a college that encourages people to think and to
right.
reinforce their moral character, and
Mhm,
someone that just kind of comes off the shelf of the public school, right?
right. So, you can legally put your family in an LLC.
Yes. So what you need is what the older Protestants would have called a family covenant. And I
Mhm,
want to distinguish between a more common perspective when people talk about a family purpose, right?
'kay,
Well, you can have and family purpose is a necessary part of this, right? We believe that God has something for us to do, but there's two ways to present that purpose, right? One way is to say, well, this is our family purpose, and it's never going to make any money, and it's never going to be successful, and you're going to have to work for the devil for years to pay for the little bit that you can do to achieve our family purpose. And basically, it's just a losing game. God set us up to fail in this life, and when we die, maybe it'll change, right?
mhm,
Or right, there's another alternative in the various theological options we have. The other option is, hey, this is our calling, this is our purpose, and this calling is profitable. This calling is actually something that creates objective value in the world. And so unless somebody is, doing, shenanigans where they're stealing from you, there's going to be value generated. And that value is going to be enough to provide richly for you and for your family. And indeed, we might say that this purpose is a covenant of blessing between your family and God, where God says, hey, this is the hill that I want you specifically, your family, to tend and cultivate and defend even. And if you'll do that, God will work it out so that you are blessed. And this is what allows for what real generational planning, right? Most Americans think, well, what do I know? How could I give my children, what would I tell my children to do? I don't want to put any restrictions on them. They're going to figure it out for themselves. Well, maybe God has actually given parents enormous insight and a critical role to play to say, hey, this is what God has made our family for. And by and large, child, you're going to be happy if you pursue that. And that's the necessary ingredient, that this understanding that there is an exchange when you come to blessing. That concept that I just ran through meets the IRS's definition of a bona fide business purpose, right? If you believe that, okay, we have a purpose up here, and we're, here's the religious language. We have a purpose, we're making sacrifices, and we have an expectation of blessing, right? Very, very vague, undefined blessing. Well, if that purpose includes, a strategic insight, it includes some kind of competitive advantage. And what is a gifting but a competitive advantage? If you're gifted, you're unreasonably good at something. Well, that's a competitive advantage in whatever, monetary system that can be applied to. And if the blessing that you believe is coming includes, it's not limited to, but includes economic profit, profitable over the credit cycle over a 50-year period, then many of those sacrifices that you're making can be recognized as business expenses of this entity. And one of the things that is very important in this context is to say, you have to actually be living in accordance with this purpose, right? So you can't be living like everyone else. You can't be going to public school and McDonald's and hope that your children are going to go get a government job, right? Now, that doesn't mean that all of your children have to enter your family business and there's some strict, narrow road. Some people are going to go their own way. Some kids are going to have, genuine gifts that you want to send them out to maximize. But if you're saying, hey, of my 4 kids, I'm going to try my darndest to explain to them and explore with them the value of staying here with us and working this land that we've been entrusted with, that we have over, hopefully future generations that we're called to exercise dominion over. But I mean, at the end of the day, the question is dominion a positive thing or a negative thing? If the exercise of Christian dominion creates value in the world, that's got to have economic implications. And this is the key thing, that you have to believe that about your family. You have to know what your family is called to. And that doesn't mean specific like business models, right? But it does mean a sense of purpose, a sense of understanding what you're for,
Okay. So, all right. I think I'm following you. So you're saying that a family could meet the definition for a legal IRS structure, define it as a company.
Yes.
And then, but the pushback would be, well, why do I need an LLC to do what you just said I could do, or what theologically I know I need to be doing anyways?
I mean, the LLC is just the cheapest legal structure that you can use to do this. There are others. They're just more expensive.
The question is whether it's LLC or not. Why would I want to put my family into some sort of corporation when I already have God's ordained, means already in front of me?
I think, looking at the family, the core contract, which is to say the marriage, the core contract of the family is not strong in our current culture. It's not easily enforceable. There is very little flexibility, and the default provisions that our culture has kind of imposed upon that contract are ruinous. And at a minimum, it ends at the end of every marriage, and every marriage will end, right, either by divorce or by death. Right. And even a happy, successful marriage, you get maybe 60, 70, maybe 80 years, right? And then it ends, and there has to be a legal transition. And every time there's a legal transition, there are taxes, there are regulatory changes, there are all sorts of things that happen. One of the things that C.R. Wiley points out in his book, Man of the House, in I think about page 32 or so, he has this side note where he says, it's sort of an oddity of our current culture that corporations are legally recognized fictional persons and
Mm-hmm.
families are not. And historically, families and theologically, families have a much better claim to being recognized as a person
Mm-hmm.
separate from their members, right? And so I think it's important to say your family has a legal structure right now. It's just a not very good one, right? Right now, the contract that creates your family is the marriage contract, which has been so twisted by our current setup
Mm-hmm.
that it's almost it's easy for anybody to break, and the default provisions, the way that your assets can be taken. And this is true not just at the first generation. Let's say you and your wife have a wonderful marriage. What about your in-law, your sons-in-laws, your daughters-in-laws? You get one bad kid or one bad spouse of a kid, and it starts to take away things. Whereas if you have a family, if the family has a legally recognized entity that can advocate for itself,
Mm-hmm.
then you can transfer property not to your children as persons, but into
Mm-hmm.
this family structure. They can still have access to it. They can still use it, but it allows us to do planning. It really allows us. It puts our families on the same level playing field as the corporations for asset protection, for longevity, for tax purposes, for all of those
Yeah.
very real, very useful benefits. I mean, the you have in some sense a right to be a business, to have a business, but you
Yeah.
probably should incorporate for the legal recognition that we give in our system.
So you're saying that there's actually some real tax advantages and long-term advantages
Hmm.
for putting your family in an LLC.
Yes,
There's a pop-up screen on your screen. You just want to click that and get it down. I don't know if you see it.
I do not see it.
All right, then don't worry about it. He doesn't see it on his screen. Pardon me. Okay, you can see it. I can just see a little pop-up. All right. So you're saying that there's some tax advantages and tremendous long-term legal advantages for putting your family into an LLC. And does that
Yes.
mean like my son becomes an employee, or he just how do you maybe answer this first question?
Mhm.
How does your family get into that LLC or family LLC or whatever?
Yeah, so formal employment might be for certain people. The main way to think of the family LLC is, people have used this phrase, the family bank, or a venture capital fund, right? This is a thing that has resources that you can apply to use based on a principled request, right? So you have a house in the family LLC. Your son comes to you and says, I want to use this house to have a family, to raise a certain amount of kids, right? Because we're at a point, objectively, what normal American families are able to afford is less than two children, right? That's what that 1.7 kids means. It means most American families cannot afford to have two or more children, right?
Mhm.
So if we want different results from that, we need to have different inputs, different strategies. We need to have different partnerships. Now, so he's essentially coming to you and saying, Father, I need help. And he does need help, right? Economically speaking, to have, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe more children as the desire and the calling of God comes upon them. And you say, great, I want you to have children, because as a business owner, the number one thing that limits my growth is qualified, legitimate heirs, especially people that are loyal to the family, that I can trust to watch the till, as it were. We can hire talent, we can hire skills. What we cannot hire is loyalty. And the more loyal players you have in your network, the more you're going to be able to expand your business, to have multiple locations, to deal with problems as they come up, because those core family members are highly motivated to keep the business going, right? They're incentivized. You've effectively solved the management problem, right?
Let me ask the question this way.
Hmm.
Um, if I put my family in an LLC, or put, my house, everything, my cars, all that in LLC,
Hmm.
um, and then, pay for Christian education,
Hmm.
um, all that stuff. How does it how does that, Gabe Wrench's LLC, family LLC,
Hmm.
how does the all that shake its way out in tax benefits.
Yeah. So we should probably back up when we're talking about that family covenant, that family purpose. There really does need to be some pretty clear articulated direction, right? So I mean, a world class example. Not everyone's going to have a purpose this big. Is going to be Jim Wilson's Principles of War, right? Which is that little booklet that he kind of laid out his long-term strategy for his family, and based on that, they moved to Moscow and started doing all of the things that they're doing, right? Now, I use that story because the Wilsons are not a client of mine, and their story is very public. But that kind of booklet, that kind of high-level purpose is recognizable in our modern system as strategic intellectual property. Okay, strategic intellectual property. And that's an asset, oftentimes a very highly valued asset, right? In some sense, you could say that all the success that the Wilsons have had, given their ability to kind of leverage things strategically, comes from that book, right? And that would make that book very, very valuable. Now, I'll quit talking about the Wilsons because I don't want to give internet people another stick to beat the Wilson clan with right now. We'll talk about a guy named Ellsworth McIntyre who's got a wonderful book called How to Start a Christian Daycare, which is my #1 recommended book for any entrepreneur starting a service-based business. I think How to Start a Christian Daycare is incredible. It used to be titled How to Make $1 Million in Christian Education. All right. Back in the early 90s when he was running with Rushdoony and some of those guys.
Okay.
So that book encapsulates his family's understanding of this is how we're going to make money. Right. This concept of how to set up a certain type of business, how to run it, how to hire people, how to fire people, how to get clients, how to structure the policies and procedures. And again, it's kind of granular to starting a Christian daycare and kind of Christian educational facility. But that's this intellectual property. It's kind of like a plan for the next 50 years, 400 years, 1,000 years, whatever. This is the plan.
Okay.
And that plan, when you put that into the family LLC, that's the core of what goes into the family LLC. Then subsidiary assets get added to serve the purposes of that plan. Okay. And then people come into agreement. They participate with the family LLC to accomplish that plan. So if your, private school expenses, if the way that you're training your children down, I mean, potentially the clothes that you buy them, if those things are an implementation of that strategic intellectual property, that's where those start to become, at least potentially, business expenses. That what allows you spending this money means it comes out of your pre-tax dollars, right? Now, I'm not giving any tax advice, or any advice on characterizing, particular expenses on this podcast. The way I work is I would sit down, we would prepare these things with the family, and we would sit down with their existing tax professionals and work through, hey, we've set up this structure. These are the expenses that we'd like to talk about. Here's our reasoning and some specific code provisions that allow us to say, hey, these could then be moved in. Now, your normal business has nothing to do really with its business purpose, is not related to what's happening at your dining room table. Okay. But a long-term family plan that requires qualified heirs, very special. You look at regular American culture. You need people that are very unusual for Americans to take over your business and advance a multi-generational plan, right? That's what begins to say these expenses can be pre-tax dollars, can be business expenses.
Yeah, and I guess this is where it interests me, because I my kids, I got 3 kids, they go to Logos, and we're spending $15,000 to $20,000 a year, and I don't get any tax benefit from that.
Right.
There's a number of expenses that I have. For example, I mean, we got chickens and horses and and those especially the chickens go into feeding my kids, right? But I don't get any tax benefits from that. In fact, I pay taxes on it. Because you go buy the chicken food and you're paying taxes on the chicken food, right? You go, so you're arguing that within this family LLC structure that a lot of these expenses could potentially become tax benefits.
Yes. Now, again,
now with your accountant and all that, and your tax advisor and all that, yeah.
Right. But again, I think from a bigger perspective, you have to have a family, you have to have a family purpose that says this is part of what we would require. Like say you met somebody that was unrelated to you, you didn't have any relationship with them, and you're trying to convince them to be like you. You're trying to make them into Gabe Wrench 2.0. Okay. Now, obviously, you can do this with your children, but the children dynamic, it makes it harder for people to see. You would tell them, hey, I want you to eat like me, dress like me, walk like me, talk like me, be me, right? That's what's going to allow you to have the same kind of success that I have, right? And if they weren't your children, if you got them to do all of those things, then them spending that money, them adopting your style of dress, them following in your footsteps would frequently be, training expenses, a business expense, especially if their sole source of funds is the business that they're working for, your business, right?
Right.
And there's no reason why that can't be done with families. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think also in a larger sense, that intellectual property asset that I mentioned at the beginning, that plan, that purpose, those can often be valued in the millions, especially if you have a cash flowing business that's moving forward. And if you have an asset, even there's a tax principle called basis. You normally don't have any basis in intellectual property assets, but there's still valuable things that, again, the corporations are doing this. The regular mainline corporations, they are using all of these same tax strategies. And this is one of the reasons why we have trouble competing, is because we are penalized and penalized and penalized as families. And really, my point is, hey, we can solve that problem. We can put your family on a level playing field with even some of the larger corporations in the world. So
now, one of the things that so CrossPolitic had to be an LLC. Because we couldn't be a nonprofit, because the 501c3 restricts your political conversations and influence and all that stuff. So but I would say kind of the same principle makes me a little nervous about LLCs, is where you're recognizing the IRS has a certain authority over you in a way the IRS would not have authority over, just Gabe's family without an LLC. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things to be clear on is you're not assigning your children to the LLC, right? They remain. You have full custody of them. That legal arrangement doesn't change. Your marriage doesn't change, right? Those existing legal structures don't go away. Sometimes people wish they could, but they cannot.
Yeah.
You retain, your personal identity with all of the risks and liabilities that comes with that. What you're doing is simply saying, hey, I have a long-term plan here. And that long-term plan that I've been given as an obligation by God meets the requirements that that the IRS has set out for what allows me to run a business and get some tax benefits. Okay, so it's not you're not losing any of your existing rights as an American. You can't really affect those. What you're just saying is, hey, these pieces of property are for a specific purpose. Now, that purpose might line up and facilitate very well the family that you hope to build, right? We hope that it does. And one of the things to remember is, if you put property into an LLC and you say this is the purpose of this property, let's say down the line one of your children wants to go a different way, that property is no longer in your estate to give them. If you said, you know what, I just want to give it to them, even though they're not following this purpose that I'd set out.
Yeah.
That becomes very difficult to do. Okay. So, so it's not something you put everything into, right? You want to retain certain things in your own name, but to the extent that you're like, well, why am I doing these things? Why am I not just sending my kids off to the public school? Why am I living in some, hard to get to place? Right. When people are making decisions based on principle, my question is always, can we find a for-profit structure within those principled decisions?
Yeah.
And frequently, especially with people who have a mindset, a positive eschatology, a positive mindset about the future, there is a belief that there's money to be made here, and that their children are an economic blessing to them.
All right. So how does it function then? Let's say I create a Gabe Wrench Family LLC, and CrossPolitic pays me a paycheck.
Right.
How does that go into the LLC? I assume it goes into the LLC as Gabe Wrench Family LLC as profit.
Yeah, so we would want, and this becomes the people that can do this need to have control over their own income. So they either need to be business owners, or they need to have a friendly relationship with their with the business owner that kind of feeds them, so
Right.
that a 1099 payment can come into the LLC directly,
Yeah.
not to your personal account. So the
Yeah.
money comes in as a 1099 payment, a vendor payment from clients, from a business that supports you, right? It comes into the family LLC as revenue. Okay. So
Right.
it's in the family LLC. And then we start saying, okay, well, what can we spend this money on that fits the purposes of the family LLC, right? And so and certain things would be, it's not 100%, right? So it might not be 100% of any school expenses. It might not be 100% of meals. It might not be 100% of certain things, right?
Right.
But there's oftentimes going to be some percentage of these purpose oriented expenses that we can write off in the family LLC. So you spend the money on a LLC debit card or credit card, and then you reimburse the LLC for any money that you needed to, or you don't actually reimburse, you account for it as a reimbursement, but then you have to take effect a distribution, which is income to you, and that money becomes a personal expense if it falls outside of the purposes of the LLC.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So
That's
that's
helpful.
how, and I would say this is not a DIY. You're going to want to have a team of professionals. You're going to want to have your existing tax professional, or somebody you know, like, and trust,
Yep.
that does that in your area. You're going to want to have a specialist like me who's helping you because many people have ideas that would qualify as the basis of a family covenant,
Yep.
but very, very few people have written them down in a book like Jim Wilson or
Yeah.
Ellsworth McIntyre. And you don't have to have a formal book, but you really do want some level of recognized documentation. This is the thing that we are doing as a family, and here's how the different businesses, the different ventures that our family has currently, fit under
Yeah.
that high level rubric. So
Yeah.
this is not a DIY kind of a thing.
Okay. And then, so that's interesting. That's helpful. I think the other area where I might see, I think there might be something to this, is inheritance tax. So
Absolutely.
where my, LLC owns my house, my Wrench family LLC owns my house, all that stuff, and I want to pass it down to my kids.
Hmm.
And let's say at this point, my house isn't worth this much, but let's say by the time I go pass it down, it's worth $20 million.
Hmm.
I want to pass it down to my kids. Well, I get, as I understand it, I would get a massive inheritance tax levied on my children. Correct?
Many times. Right. If you died right now, you would not. But by the time you're going to pass, for sure, the inheritance tax will almost
What
certainly
if
be
I
lower.
died right now? They
Right,
would.
right now, it's the exemption limit is $24 million, and that lasts until the end of this year, and
Oh,
then it will
okay.
drop
Let's
by
say
half.
30 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's say
yeah,
30
yeah.
million. My kids, they'd get taxed significantly. It's like
They
50%,
would.
isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It is very high, very
Let's
high.
say, I buy this old farmhouse, which I actually have an old farmhouse, and
Mm-hmm.
it just happens to, strike gold over the next 40 years. And
Mm-hmm.
it goes from a $300,000 10-acre house to, you know, $50 million house. Then my kids, who don't make much more money than I do, I just happen to have this house that increased in value over time.
Right.
They tax something like $25 million. Correct? That's about 50.
Yes. It would be a massive hit on you guys, for
Because
sure.
I know farmers who've had that happen,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still, tilling the same soil.
Right.
They aren't making, hundreds of millions of dollars,
Right.
but the value of the house is that,
Mm-hmm.
and so they've had to sell
Huge
1,000
chunks.
of acres, huge chunks of their farmland,
Yes.
to pay for that inheritance tax.
Yes.
And so that's the idea I have in back in my mind. But so if you have your house in the LLC, well, it's never passed down in that way. It's never
Correct.
faced that inheritance tax, but that house is always in the family.
Correct. Well, and so when you put something in an LLC, you have ownership interests in the LLC. So you don't own the house directly. You have a percentage or a share-based interest in LLCs. They're called units. You have a certain amount of units in the LLC.
Yep.
So then the question is, what is the value of those units?
Mhm.
And we always track value by what you could sell it for right now. Okay.
Mhm.
And if you have a family LLC, one restriction you might say is, well, you just can't sell it to anybody who isn't descended from Gabe Wrench, right?
Yeah.
That kind of limits the pool, and that allows for just there's something called the 30% safe harbor. So the IRS will just allow you to say it's valued at $100 million, but we're going to say it's only worth 70 million, right?
Uh-huh.
Just off the top, okay.
Yeah.
And then you can layer on additional restrictions of what kind of people they have to be, what kind of, and to back up, you think about the logic of the parsonage exemption, right? The parsonage exemption doesn't make very much sense now because you can live anywhere as a pastor and you still get the parsonage exemption.
Right.
But back in the day, when the parsonage was on the church grounds, right? So you have the church, and then right behind it you have the parsonage, the pastor's house, right? So he gets to live there for free, but everyone in the congregation knows where he lives, and at least in theory could come and knock on his door at any time of day or night, and often did, right? And so that was used as an argument to say, well, this house isn't worth anything, right? I mean, who aside from somebody who really has a divine calling on their life, no one is going to want to live there and sign up for those kinds of restrictions, right? Now there's kind of an art to this, right? Because you want your family, whom you've had the opportunity to train, and you've shown them, hey, these restrictions are for your benefit, right? There's that verse in the Psalms, the lines have fallen for me in beautiful places. I have a beautiful inheritance, right? Pleasant places, I have a beautiful inheritance. That's the idea of hey, maybe for other people this isn't very good, but for me, this is perfect. This fits me exactly the way that I want it, right? And that's what you want for your children to say, hey, this is because the question is, what would the ordinary American consumer pay for a property restricted in this manner? And the answer is not much, much, right? Especially when for long periods of time, those family LLC interests are they're not the right to sell the property. They're the right to receive a certain amount of benefit, or in many times it's, congratulations, you have the right to a job if you want one, right? And what is that worth? Well, it's certainly not worth millions of dollars, right? Especially if you're going to have to put in the labor and put in the time to make that happen. So and that can be a profound blessing to a family, right? Because when you die, if you own land directly, you're taxed essentially on your right to sell it and turn it into a development, or your hypothetical right to sell it and turn it into a development, right? Your right to change the character of the land, to industrialize it, right? And what about a family that doesn't want to do that? Well, they're not going to derive any benefit from that land in its current form. They're not going to get that crazy valuation. They're not going to turn it into a subdivision. They're not going to turn it into houses or commercial park. But they're taxed as though they are, because they retain the legal right to do so. Well, if you will just put in writing, hey, God told us not to do that, and so we're not going to do that. And we're going to say for 20 years we can't do it, and in 20 years we can discuss it for a 6-month period, and if we don't agree to sell it in that 6-month period, it goes back in for another 20 years, and that just kind of keeps on going until we get tired of doing that, right? But that's that property, then you don't have to pay the price of something that God has told you not to do, especially if that's your family's conviction.
And so I know there's other structures for people who make more money, that kind of thing, that you can kind of get into. We aren't going to go there right now, but basically you're kind of recommending like this, family LLC structure for maybe someone who makes like 250,000 or less or something, who are you kind of recommending this kind of structure for?
Yeah, probably 250,000 up, up to 2 million. So kind of, if you're making less than 250,000, if you're a small business owner, you just need a good, country accountant that's gonna help advise you on what can be run through your business with a proper tax plan. And you shouldn't be paying, especially if you have 4, 5, 6 kids, you're not going to be paying very much in taxes if your business is grossing 250, right? But as you outgrow that, there's a lot of people that hit a wall between 250 and 350 where it's like, wow, I am just getting hammered on taxes as I try to grow my business. Especially because businesses actually have control. It's not automatically taken out every month. You have to budget for it, and sometimes you want that money for expenses or to do nice things for your family. And it's like, wow, and oftentimes it becomes a real struggle for a business owner, especially if they were an entrepreneur before they were married. Because when you're unmarried, you can write up a huge amount of your life. Well, as soon as you're married, you got the wife, you got the kids, you got the house, you got the car for them. You can't write off those expenses in your ordinary business because what's going on at your dinner table has nothing to do with that business.
Right.
But if you have a business entity that has a valid business purpose that says, hey, we want control, we have an interest, an economic interest in what's going on at Gabe's dinner table, well, then at least potentially those expenses become business deductions. So that's the conversation, at least.
That's great. Gregory Treats, attorney and strategic consultant. You can find more about what he's doing at avaloncircle.com. Avalon, Avalon, Avalon Circle, like not a square, it's a circle. AvalonCircle.com. Gregory, thank you for joining us, man. Appreciate your time with Business Makers.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, download the app, your favorite store, and we will be off next week because I'm taking my kids on a little spring break trip. Other than that, we'll be back in the studio producing Business Makers the following week. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining us, and hope you have a good couple weeks. Lord bless.